Hello, everybody. We're going to get started. Unfortunately, the pizza's late, so if you're here for just the pizza, bear with us.
Please don't leave.
Yeah, please don't leave either. So for those that don't know me, my name is Michael Hernandez. I'm the president of the Latinx Law Student Association. I'm also on the executive board of ACS, and we are co-sponsoring this event today, so thank you all for coming. Briefly, I'm going to introduce our panelists today. First, we have Professor Luis Fuentes-Rower. Some of you may know him. He is the Harry T. Ice Faculty Fellow, and he teaches and writes in areas of civil rights and legal history with a particular emphasis on constitutional law and the Reconstruction era. He received his JD and PhD from the University of Michigan and his LLM from Georgetown. He joined the faculty in 2002. Next, we have Christine Popp. Christine is a partner with Popp and Bullman. When Christine opened the doors to her law practice in 2012, she looked forward to running a private firm with a public interest focus. She practices exclusively immigration law. She is currently the chapter chair of the Indiana chapter of American Immigration Lawyers Association and is on the board of directors of the National American Immigration Lawyers Association. So with that being said, we're going to go ahead and turn the floor over to them. So Christine, if you want to start.
Oh, I start? Okay. All right. Can everybody hear me? Okay. So I'm just going to give a very somewhat brief overview of a few changes in immigration law, and then we're going to have, I think we're supposed to have a conversation and questions that follow from that. Just to start, there have been in the last 3 years more than 700 changes to immigration law. Obviously, I can't talk about all of those in the next 10 to 15 minutes. I'm only going to focus on some of the bigger ones. Of those 700, there have been more than 80 that significantly and fundamentally changed immigration. And if you probably have noticed, there haven't been that much notification of laws coming out of Congress. So almost all of the changes have been done by regulation, executive order, policies, and to a lesser extent by courts. The ones that I'm going to focus on and just talk about very briefly today are the right to asylum at the border, a public charge ground of inadmissibility, issues related to the politicization of immigration courts, and if I have some time left over, I'll talk about issues related to unlawful presence of students, international students, and maybe even DACA. But I'm also open to answer any questions about anything. As long as I know the answer to it, I will answer. So starting with asylum process at the border, if any of you follow the news, this has really been an issue for the last 3 years. But things have kind of changed over time. In 2018, we started seeing what's called metering at the border. And I guess I should say, like, all of these things have really changed the way people apply for asylum. It used to be that when you cross the border, under asylum law, no matter how you crossed, if you crossed with a visa, if you used a fake passport, or if you just crossed in the desert completely without status, you had the right to apply for asylum. The statute and international law are very clear. It doesn't matter how you get here, you have that right. So all of the changes that have been made by policy under the Trump administration have changed the way people access that right. In 2018, we started to see what's called metering. And metering means that anybody who tried to enter at a port of entry, so this is like San Ysidro or in Laredo, any of those places, they would be turned back into Mexico, and they have to put their name on a list, and they'd be given a number. And every day, the CBP would tell whoever was in charge of the numbers how many people could come in, and if your number was called, you got to go in. There are lots of problems with this. First of all, they weren't supposed to turn back Mexicans because then they were turning back Mexicans into Mexico where they were fearing persecution. And two, they weren't supposed to turn back unaccompanied children. But both of those things were happening. And I actually was able to volunteer in Tijuana at the end of 2018, in December of 2018, and I saw that. One of the first people I met with to help with their asylum case was a Mexican family who had been turned back into Mexico and they feared persecution. There were also many unaccompanied children who couldn't even go near the border because the federales, the Mexican police, hung out near the port of entry, And if they saw an unaccompanied minor, they would take them into custody for their own good, right, because they're children, and then send them back to their home country where they fled persecution. So this is what was happening with metering in 2018. Looks like pizzas are here for those of you who just came for pizza. That, I guess, was not good enough at keeping people from coming into the U.S. And I should say, at the time that I was there in December, it was about a 4-month wait to be called into the United States. So people were having to figure out a way to survive in Tijuana. And the time that I spent there, we met people from, I think, 11 different countries, if I remember correctly. Many of them were from Africa, from Russia, from Brazil, and from other countries in Latin America. So people came from all over into Tijuana with the intention of crossing. In 2019, the Trump administration started the Remain in Mexico program. It's technically called the Migrant Protection Protocols, although we tend to call it the Migrant Persecution Program. So that started in 2019. Since then, about 60,000 people have been turned back into northern Mexico to await their asylum hearing. It's very dangerous in northern Mexico. In one of the areas, Tamaulipas, it has the same level of danger by the Department of State as Syria, Yemen, or Afghanistan. So this is many people who are being turned back. They are being kidnapped, they're being robbed, they're being raped, they're being murdered, everything that you can imagine. For those who are able to come in and have their immigration hearing, which takes place often in a tent with a judge appearing by video, only about 5% have access to a lawyer. So of the 60,000, only about 5% have had access to a lawyer. There are some exemptions to the migrant to remain in Mexico. Those would be unaccompanied children are supposed to be allowed to come in and apply for asylum without waiting their turn in Mexico. People with disabilities and Mexicans are all supposed to be allowed in. For a long time, it was only people who spoke Spanish were being turned back into Mexico to await their asylum hearing. Anybody who spoke any other language was supposed to be allowed into the U.S. to go through their asylum process here. But just a couple weeks ago, the U.S. started to send Brazilians back, so Portuguese-speaking are now having to go into northern Mexico. If you are not one of the exceptions, the only way to have your right to apply for asylum in the U.S. without waiting in Mexico is if you can prove that you are more likely than not to suffer persecution in Mexico on account of your race, your nationality, your religion, your political opinion, or your membership in a social group. And the problem with this is that you have to affirmatively tell the immigration officer that you have that fear. They will not ask you. And there was a very great story on This American Life where they talked to asylum officers about that. And one of the asylum officers said he spoke with a Honduran family that had been robbed by the Mexican police because they were Honduran. And he tried the best he could to get them to say that they feared persecution because they were Honduran. But because they didn't say those words, he had to send them back to Mexico to await their asylum hearing. Yet again, that wasn't enough. So then, after that, was the transit ban. The transit ban started in July of 2019. The transit ban says that anyone crossing the southern border can't apply for asylum in the U.S. unless they have applied for asylum in the other countries that they traveled through first. This applies very broadly. So an international student who comes here to study at IU, goes to Mexico for spring break, and crosses at the border to come back in the U.S., that person is now excluded from applying for asylum in the U.S. They have to go back to Mexico and apply for asylum there first. So it's a very broadly worded ban. There are no exceptions for people like unaccompanied children. Mexicans don't apply to this because they come directly to the U.S. from their country of persecution, but any other country that goes through Mexico, through Honduras, through El Salvador, they have to go back to those countries, apply for asylum first, be denied, and then try here in the U.S. Finally, the last changes started in October of 2019, and these are special programs that create what's called an expedited removal process for people who are seeking asylum in the U.S. These are people who are not subject to remain in Mexico. So they're Mexicans, they may be unaccompanied children. Anybody who does not qualify to remain in Mexico has this new process. They stay in a CBP facility called a hielera in Spanish, which means icebox. So they stay there for about a week, which is longer than they're allowed to under law. They're supposed to only be there 72 hours. They're given about a 30-minute call to whomever they want to talk to. Maybe it's a lawyer, maybe it's a family member. That's all they can do for the time they're there. And then they have their asylum interview with an officer. They have no access to their belongings because they've had their belongings taken away, so any evidence they have to prove their asylum case is not available to them. And if they're denied, which they're going to be, then they are going to have an appeal in front of an immigration judge by video. Of course, the majority of people and all of these policies are denied asylum. Asylum is a very legal process. It's very hard to prove asylum, even in the best of circumstances. But if you're coming in from another country and you speak no English, you have no idea about the system, all you know is that you're afraid of being killed in your home country, you're probably going to lose your case, because you have to be able to prove not just that you're afraid of being killed, you have to say that you're afraid of being killed on account of one of the enumerated reasons. And people don't really realize that is the case. So that's asylum in a nutshell. I've already taken much of my time, but I'm going to keep going for a couple other things. The next major change we have seen recently is what we call the public charge ground of inadmissibility. So grounds of inadmissibility are barriers or ineligibilities to people getting a visa or immigration status in the U.S., and there are lots of them. It could be a crime, it could be an immigration violation, medical condition, anything. But public charge specifically means that someone is going to come into the United States and apply for public benefits. And it applies to many immigrants coming in, not so much employment-based immigrants, but people coming through family, people coming through temporary visas. They all have this ground of inadmissibility apply to them. In the past, someone could, I should say, to overcome this ground of inadmissibility, which is found to apply to anyone, you had your sponsor, which is usually the person who is helping you immigrate here, sign a contract with the government that said they would support you and keep you off of public benefits. So traditionally, until today, actually, literally today, the idea was that the burden of proving that you wouldn't be a public charge fell on your petitioner. So if I'm an immigrant and I'm married to a U.S. citizen and my citizen petitioned for me to immigrate to the U.S. to join him, then that person had the burden of proving that I wouldn't become a public charge through a contract. As of today, the new rule is that the immigrant bears that burden. And one factor is the contract. That's only one factor in an analysis called the totality of the circumstances analysis. So they look at age, they look at health or medical conditions, your income, your assets, your liabilities, your debts, your work experience, your ability to speak English. All of these things are now looked at to determine whether or not you can immigrate. If you can imagine, these are rules that favor young people with education who perhaps have good jobs already or will clearly be able to get a good job in the U.S., who speak English, who are well educated. This is a process that will favor the favored immigrants, not the disfavored. So the parents of citizens are going to have a hard time now. People with any kind of disability are going to have a hard time now. Anybody who doesn't speak English is going to have a hard time getting a visa to come to the United States. So the burden has shifted now. Who knows how this is going to be applied? Like I said, it's literally today is the first day. I know in our office last week we were pushing through as many cases as we could to get filed before the deadline so they would fall under the old rules. And then Friday afternoon, the Department of State announced that their new rule went into effect today too with only a weekend's of notice. So I was telling Luis that this morning, I have a client going for her visa interview tomorrow, so this morning, without really knowing how the law is going to be applied, had to make up my own argument for why she qualified. So I don't exactly know what's going to happen with this. If you are found to be a public charge, you can, at the discretion of the immigration officer, you can pay a public charge bond, which is going to be around minimum of $8,000. Most of it's going to be a cash bond. So you have to be able to pay $8,000 or more dollars in cash in order to be able to immigrate here to be with your family member. Want me to keep going? Okay. The next thing I wanted to talk about was the polarization, the politicization of the immigration courts. And this has been an area that's really insane. I just want to give you sort of context of why all of these things are changing. When President Trump took office, one of his senior advisors is a man named Stephen Miller. Have you all heard of Stephen Miller? Stephen Miller, I don't know what's going on with him, but he really does not like immigration. And he used to be an aide to Jeff Sessions. And the two of them pretty much had a plan to on how, through executive orders and policies, they could fundamentally change immigration. And say what you want about President Trump, but he has kept his promise to change immigration. And it's been through Stephen Miller's plans. They've really been able to do all of these things. At the immigration court, we have seen a real erosion of due process. Not that there was any due process before, but to the small amount that there was is now basically gone. So immigration courts are administrative courts. That means they're in front of an ALJ, an administrative law judge called an immigration judge. There are no rules of procedure that apply, although we can argue some rules, that the federal rules apply in certain circumstances. So you can object to hearsay evidence, you can object to leading questions or whatever, but the judge gets to make the determination whether it's really, they're going, how they want to rule on that. It's really in the judge's discretion. There's also just really no right to a fair hearing in immigration court. And one of the previous heads of the immigration court judges called it trying a capital murder case with traffic court rules. And that's really what it has always been. We deport people in an administrative function without all of the rights that a person might otherwise have under the Constitution and rules of procedure. But it's gotten worse because of many things. First of all, they've taken away the right or the discretion of judges to issue continuances. So judges basically, unless there's a really strong reason, can't grant a continuance on a case. Second, they took away the right of judges to manage their docket by closing cases or terminating cases. So someone might have an immigration benefit pending, like they may be a victim of domestic violence and they filed for immigration benefits under the Violence Against Women Act. Before, we could get continuances or even administrative closure to let them just live here until we got a decision, and then they would terminate the case. Now that's not available anymore, so judges can't close cases. They can't terminate cases unless there's some fundamental constitutional issue, such as a Fourth Amendment violation in the seizure of the immigrant. So judges have no discretion to manage their docket. And they also now have quotas. They have a number of cases they have to make a decision on every year, so they can't take their time. Some immigration officers are going to have a lot of asylum cases. Others are going to have other kinds of cases. And it doesn't matter what your docket looks like. You have to do 700-something cases a year. And now the Department of Justice, which controls the immigration court, they're trying to decertify the union of immigration judges, because the immigration judges have been complaining to their union and to the Department of Justice officials about this. Now they're trying to decertify the union and take away their union rights as immigration judges. Finally, the last thing that has really changed is that and this has always been a right of the Attorney General, but it's getting worse. So the Attorney General is allowed to certify cases up to himself. So when someone loses at the immigration judge, they appeal to the Board of Immigration Appeals, which is an administrative appellate body, and then they can appeal to the circuit courts from there. So often when a case gets to the Board of Immigration Appeals, if it's a particularly interesting issue, the AG will take the case and make his own decision on this. And this is where we've seen really fundamental changes in asylum law and the issue about continuances. These are through the AG, and there's really no review of this. It's considered a policy-making or rule-making part within the APA, so the Administrative Procedures Act. So I could keep going on and on and on, but I think we wanted to leave time for questions.
Well, good afternoon, and thank you for being here. I, too, could go on if I were so inclined. There you are. I'd rather not, because I'd rather you get a chance to speak and to ask the questions that you have. First of all, thank you, ACS, for doing this. Thank you, Christy, Christy's probably one of the maybe back up, the busiest people I know. She works all the time, and as you just heard, they're not making it easy on her. And so I thank you for making time to speak to our students. I am so grateful. I'm trying to get Christy to get more involved in the law school. This is one entry point of hopefully many others. So let me just say a few things, and then I'm going to ask you a few questions so that we can just have a brief conversation, and then I'm going to hopefully open it up for questions. I'll open up for questions. Hopefully you will have them. So Heather Cox Richardson, whom I know from she's a historian at BC. She, a few days ago, wrote, she's apparently Facebook's historian. I don't really know what that means, but that's what, and she writes also for The Guardian. She published a post on Facebook talking about the idea that we've been, and let me back up a second. When I hear Christy talk about this moment in history, my blood pressure rises. I mean, it's daunting. So many things happening at once. And so I study history, and I raise voting rights, legal history. And I think about, when I think about voting and rights, I think about, we've been here before. Well, think immigration. Unfortunately, we've been here before too, and that gives me hope. They asked her, or maybe she volunteered, to the point where, have we seen this before? Have we been here before? She said, 3 times I think of. One, and think about these moments. 1850, and think about what happened in 1850, right? The Compromise of 1850. Think about 1854, Kansas-Nebraska Act. Think about Dred Scott in 57, and think about 1860, Lincoln, and yes, Civil War. The know-nothings were at the time, if you know that part of our history. But a nativist party rose in prominence in ways that we had yet seen in this country. It was a moment, right, immigration, the potato famine, right, in Europe and Ireland. All of that stuff was happening. 1850s, first moment, she says. Second moment, 1890. Think about what's happening in 1890. When you see the charts of immigration in this country, the historical charts, you see that 1890, that's when the charts take off, the close of the century. And then she said a third moment, and of course we had a lot of stuff happening on the ground, including expansion. Think of the Spanish-American War, 1898, 97, Puerto Rico, Guam, Philippines. That story happens then as the U.S. is becoming an empire. Think of the third moment, 1920. And think about, right, the 1924 Immigration Act, which is the first, the racial quota bill, which ended in 1965. Go back to 1890, Chinese exclusion is happening then. I mean, these moments, right, you can track them. And she says, right, we seem to be at one of those moments now. And the hope for me, if that's the right word, is that I think we overcame those. And it took a lot of work. It took people on the ground. It took mass social movements, but nothing else changes. Nothing changes without those. So I can only hope and hope that this too shall pass. In the meantime, of course, Christy could tell you stories that would just break your heart, of cases of clients, of things happening to real people. If you want to be really upset, read the recent Wolf versus Cook County opinion. It's 7 pages. It's not even an opinion. The Supreme Court basically lifted a stay. This is like last week. And Sotomayor wrote a caustic, a sharp, a heartfelt, pick a word, dissent. She's saying, what are we doing? What are we, the Supreme Court, doing? How do you explain? And the larger point for me is, which is when Christy spoke about the politicization of immigration courts, I'm more worried about the politicization of the U.S. Supreme Court. To my view, and I wrote a piece recently writing about this, thinking about this, I think the Chief Justice is playing a dangerous game, which is not the topic for here today. I'm happy to say more, but we're not here to talk about that. The Chief Justice, I'm talking about Chief Justice Roberts. But that speaks to some of the issues here. The court seems to be aligning with some of the moves that Christie's talking about. And that, to me, is dangerous as anything we've seen in the last decade, if not more. That said, Christy, in fact, let me ask you this, in reference to, and I have views of my own. How do you explain all of this? If I were to tell me this is your story, it's a haunting story. Can you make sense of it? What explains it?
I dig myself out from my my whole own day-to-day stuff when I think about the larger picture. And I think it comes from a deep-seated fear of immigrants, a deep-seated hatred of immigrants. And I don't know enough about politics. I just read about it. I mean, I can talk about immigration law forever. But I definitely have seen, as an immigration lawyer over the last decade or so, how there have been many changes to the way people talk about immigrants and this fear that people have. That was what President Trump campaigned on the last time, was this idea that these people are invading our borders. These people are coming in. They're sending their worst. They're coming to rape us and kill us. And ICE has continued, ICE being the Immigration and Customs Enforcement, they have continued this. ICE, if you read their website or you read any of their Facebook posts or Twitter posts, it's all about the criminal immigrants that they have captured, the gang members who did this or that. And it's really portraying immigrants as evil or as coming to hurt us, and not really as part of the fundamental fabric of our country. That's about all I can say. I think it comes from a deep-seated fear from the voters and a deep-seated hatred by the politicians of immigrants.
So you think that it would take, in order to overturn or to think of a future, it would take education. It would take, what would it take?
Well, I think education is really important. People don't understand how immigration law works. And the other side, frankly, has been better at explaining what's going on, has been better at explaining the issues, explaining their side of how immigrants are and what they're doing and why they're coming here. And portraying this idea of 11 million people here as just lawbreakers, right? That's the number of estimated undocumented population. What the pro-immigration side has not done is say, well, 11 million people are here unlawfully present, but that is not a crime. They're not committing a crime by being here unlawfully present. They're just living here. Not to say that every immigrant, like no immigrants have ever committed a crime, but to portray the whole undocumented populace as this is really, I don't know, they have controlled the narrative. And I hear it when I talk to people. They talk about the illegals, you know, these sorts of terms, not meaning to say anything bad, but that's just the term that they've heard in the news. The illegals have done this, as if being unlawfully present, which is not a crime, makes you somehow illegal. You know, I think talking and getting out information about what immigration is and how it works and changing that narrative is the only way to win back voters. Because I do think people are fundamentally kind people, most people, and I'm optimistic that with education they might feel differently, but no.
Can I ask you a final question, and then we can open it up for your questions? So as you speak about all these changes, first of all, that's a lot of changes. You also spoke about statutory law and international law. You didn't speak about it, you referred to both of those. So how do you explain legally all these changes? Like surely they're not illegal changes. They're not outside the law, I'm assuming, changes. So what are they? Reinterpretations of old law? Is it the administration finding vague language and reinterpreting that language? Or how is this possible?
So some of the changes are illegal, and the courts have found a lot of the policies, or many of the policies, to be unconstitutional or in violation of the statute. A lot of the things that are happening at the border just take a while for the news to get out and for there to be a legal challenge. And then the process of stopping takes a while to go through the courts. There is a lot of effort to stop many of these unlawful changes. However, what we've seen is that oftentimes it makes its way, the lower courts stay whatever the issue is. It makes it up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court says, well, we're just going to let it go forward until the litigation resolves itself. So we've seen that with the migrant persecution, the Remain in Mexico program. It was stayed by a lower court. The Supreme Court has let it go forward. Same with the public charge ground of inadmissibility. The Supreme Court let it go forward. Those are supposedly, according to the Trump administration, reinterpretations of policy, of rules, and they went through the rulemaking process in accordance with the Administrative Procedures Act. The argument is that it does not follow what Congress intended in the statute, but these are challenges that are making their way through the courts.
And this is a whole conversation that I'd be happy to have with you afterwards. The idea that the court, U.S. Supreme Court, has begun to, but first, the Trump administration is more willing and eager to come to the court to lift injunctions in ways that the Obama and George Bush administrations were unwilling. I believe I read a number, 8 times over 16 years, the administrations came to the court to ask for a lift of injunctions. In the first 2.5 years, the Trump administration came to the U.S. Supreme Court, I believe, 20 times. Because, and it gets really tricky really fast. Point being, the court, which is where Sotomayor's dissent came in, complaining about that. We're changing the rules. We're behaving in ways we didn't before. Why the arguments are shifting. Let's be clear, we're still the U.S. Supreme Court. We don't have to be. So people are saying, you're becoming a branch, which is what I meant about the Roberts Court playing a dangerous game. And this is a long-standing debate dating back decades about the court being careful. It dates back, in fact, to Federal 78. Right? The court has to be careful. This court is not being, to my mind, careful enough. And it's not going to end up well for it. I don't think. That said, we should probably open it up. We have like 20 minutes. I know 1 o'clock is our, if not, so I don't want to just go any further than I have to. So.
Hi. So my question is about the work being done in Indiana, since we aren't right on the border of Mexico or somewhere else. How does it differ, or how is it the same?
In terms of asylum specifically?
Yeah.
So when someone is finally allowed to enter the United States, which fewer and fewer are here to apply for asylum, the traditional process would be someone would be allowed to come into the U.S., they would be in detention, they would have a credible fear interview with a USCIS asylum officer, so that's the affirmative benefit side of immigration, and then they would be released or paroled or bonded out, however ICE wanted to do it, until they had their formal asylum hearing in front of an immigration judge. So people who went through that process would often come to Indiana, not everybody, but if they had family here. So we still have cases here of Hondurans, El Salvadorans, Guatemalans, Mexicans, Venezuelans, people who've come in through the border who were let in previously prior to 2019, and their immigration cases are pending. Very few people now, unless they are Mexican, because they're not supposed to be sent back to Mexico, or another country that doesn't speak Spanish. Anyone who speaks Spanish is getting sent back to Mexico. Other people are supposed to be allowed in. And so we still do see those cases here, and we just go through the immigration court process in Chicago versus down at the border.
How, as law students right now, with not a lot of money and not a lot of resources and not a lot of knowledge yet, how can we help or make an impact before we can graduate and get out into the world and make a larger impact?
So, like I said before, a huge part of tackling the immigration issue is going to be education and taking back the narrative of immigrants as something to fear. So I think to the extent that people can talk about it and share that information on social media and with family, that's huge. Writing to Congress people about your, even though you're going to get a standard boilerplate letter back that, you know, it's clearly they didn't read your letter. I think they count those letters. They see how many people from their whatever state or district is really against these rules. That's going to make a difference. And you can always volunteer at the border. If it's within your resources, they need volunteers, especially people who speak Spanish. But even if you don't speak Spanish, volunteers are needed at the border to help with these things. And law students can do a lot to help with asylum cases. And in some cases, even appear in immigration court under a supervisor of a lawyer.
Hi. What administrative law kind of principles would you like to see kind of changed or reformed? And you see any hope in the possibility that the kind of the pro-immigration side of the left and the kind of admin law reform on the right could kind of have a crossover? If you look at Gorsuch's most famous admin law, it's an immigration case, which was reforming there. Do you see any hope for that?
Do I see any hope for administrative law changes in this administration or just in the future? My hope, let me say this, that immigration seems to be really a left and right issue, but that is somewhat recent. Even under George W. Bush, he was very pro-immigration. I don't like to think of immigration as a right and left issue, and it shouldn't be, but that seems to be where it's going right now. So having said that, what changes? I would like all of those 700 things that were changed to go back to the way they were before. And they weren't perfect, but then we can make some progress to make changes. I mean, there are so many things that I could say. There are very punitive laws that penalize people who cross the border without inspection, which has somewhat created this problem, if you want to call it, of undocumented immigration in the U.S. If you come to the U.S. and you're unlawfully present for over a year, you're going to be barred for 10 years if you leave. So who wants to leave? Because then you can't come back for 10 years. Or if you've done that twice, you're permanently barred from ever getting legal status, right? So why would you ever leave the United States and your family and your home? So that's something, so there are those sorts of things that are changing. Is there anything specific that you think of that? So what I want to see, and this is actually something the American Immigration Lawyers Association is advocating for very hard this year, is to take the immigration courts out of the Department of Justice and make it a separate Article I court, a congressionally created court. And then they would be subject to the rules of federal procedure and due process. So there would be tenured professional judges, not ALJs, handling deportation cases.
Hello. So you said there were about 700 changes. Do any of those changes affect those individuals who have already gone through the immigration process or have a status already?
Yeah, so many changes happened at the immigration court level where people are facing deportation, and people who have lawful status can face deportation too, depending on if they violated their status or something like that. There were rules. The Trump administration tried to pass a policy and it was just a policy, to redefine how unlawful presence applies to students who were here. So if a student did something to violate their status, then they would be unlawfully present, which they weren't before. So that affected people. Luckily, this was a violation of the APA because it was issued as a policy manual or policy memo and didn't go through the regulatory rulemaking process. And so for that reason, it was overturned by the courts. But there are lots of these rules that do apply to people who are here lawfully in status. The public charge ground of inadmissibility, it can, in certain circumstances, apply to people who are in status if they're changing from one status to another status. So, yeah, a lot of them do. They're not all just targeted towards the asylum seekers at the border.
Hey, I've been a little surprised to realize at Maurer that we don't really have immigration law classes very often, and it's not a huge emphasis here at Maurer. So I'm wondering if that's a trend nationwide, and like, what do you see the future of the legal profession regarding immigration law?
I think this is his pet peeve, but so it's a hot issue. It's sexy right now. It's very sexy, and a lot of people want to get into immigration for sure. And I don't know what's going to happen in the future if it becomes less sexy. If fewer people will be interested, there'll be some new issue. But I would say across the country, more and more people are really interested in immigration. It's a very complicated area of the law. So when you start to practice, you really have to practice under someone who has experience, which can make it even more difficult to like get a job and get the knowledge that you need. But I think certainly classes and practical type courses are beneficial in helping with that, because not everybody can do an internship at a public interest law firm over the summer, right, to get that experience.
If you ask students about 10 years ago, why are you here? I don't think you'd ever hear anybody talk about immigration law. I can't remember them. Now, when we first year of school, first week of school, when we ask students, more than a few. One time I counted over a dozen students saying, I am here because I want to do that. And it's tricky to move that needle, to build a consensus, or what is the word, the trendy word, to build a critical mass of people who will teach it. But what we have instead is people in the community, right, who have a lot of knowledge, and what she said about pet peeve, trying to connect those practitioners with our students in ways that benefit you, which is the reason we're here. And it takes time. Norms shift slowly, I am told. But we're working on it. Good question.
Do you have any advice for people who are preparing to enter the immigration field as an attorney?
I think my biggest piece of advice is just to find a really good mentor. That's really the most important. I think it's very hard for people to graduate and go straight into immigration just because there's not a lot of places hiring. And I always tell people who want to go into immigration but can't find a job, just go into any kind of area of the law, because the fundamental things you learn from practicing early on, you can take with you to every area of the law. Case management, how to talk to clients, how to go into court. Those are all really good things to know. And then you can also do pro bono cases in the immigration field with nonprofits that will train you and supervise you. And once you've gotten a few under your I can't even think of the term, sorry. I'm a little tired. Under your wings, under your belt, thank you. Under your belt. Once you've gotten a few under your belt, then you can maybe start to practice more. I mean, taking administrative law is very helpful. I found it really boring when I took it in law school, but I use it all the time now. So I think that that's something that's really good. But otherwise, there's really no classes that you need so much as just practical experience and learning how to read the statute and the regulations and how everything interacts.
Can I ask you quickly on that point? I thought of admin law because it's at the center. Can you think of any other classes that are necessary, but that you wish, looking back, you had taken? Boy, it would have been so helpful if I only had taken that.
That is a really good question.
The answer could be no.
Well, personally, I don't. I think administrative law and any kind of trial practice type class those are both very helpful in any kind of practice. I mean, I really just think that the fundamentals of practicing law, you can get any kind of legal experience, like any kind of clinic. Just learning how to talk to clients is really helpful. And immigration, at least I do a lot of humanitarian immigration. I deal with a lot of traumatized people, and that can be very hard to learn to have that conversation with people who have experienced really intense trauma. And so anything that teaches you how to deal with that, I don't know if there are seminar courses here that do it. Those are all very, very helpful. Did you have a question?
You answered my question.
Okay.
I work in the career service office. I wanted to ask about ways that students can get involved and about things that you would say students should do to prepare for a career in immigration. Did they ask those questions?
Regarding the new countries they added to the immigration ban, what is the scope of that ban actually? Does it affect like H1B visas? And I know it doesn't affect student visas, but like...
I can just tell you basically from memory. I don't have all of this, but yes, I think Nigeria, Tanzania, Sudan. Yes, in each country had different rules apply. I don't know what the basis of this was. So some countries, it was just the diversity visa lottery. They couldn't apply for that. In other countries, it was just permanent resident status, but not temporary status. I don't really know what the justification for that is. I mean, they have some sort of security justification, but it doesn't, I guess I don't know why they would pick those particular things for each of those countries. It's not as broad as the previous ban, which covered almost every kind of visa from the countries that were subject to the ban.
I'm just wondering if you have any books that you recommend or different things to watch to just become more informed about what's happening.
I have heard that on Netflix there is a series called Undocumented, and one of the first ones, my friend, fellow immigration lawyer Andrea Martinez, was the lawyer that was featured there. I told her that I could never watch it, so I'm just telling you that it's supposed to be really good. I can't personally watch that because I have to compartmentalize and shield myself from horrible things in my free time. Otherwise, I'll never recover from the trauma that I see every day. So I haven't seen it, but I've heard it's very, very good. And Andrea, I mean, I know what happened to her. She was showing up at so early on in the Trump administration, they started deporting people who were subject to orders of supervision. Under the Obama administration, there are many people who were ordered deported who otherwise should have left but had amazing factors in their favor to allow them to stay here. They'd lived here a long time. They had citizen relatives. They had some sort of disease that was getting treatment. So they were put on orders of supervision and had to check in with ICE every year. Soon into the Trump administration's reign in 2017, once people showed up for those ICE check-ins, they were picked up and deported. So Andrea, knowing that this was likely to happen to her client, had the media there, had protesters there, and she showed up with her client for the check-in meeting. And things kind of turned bad, and an ICE officer pushed her down and broke her ankle. She was also secretly mic'd. And so he took her in, and she was like, "Why did you push me down? Why did you break my ankle?" And he's like, "Well, there's just a lot of people there," and totally admitted to everything. So it's a really interesting story, and I've seen the videos, but I haven't seen the show. An old book that I really like is, I think it's called The Devil's Highway. Is that what it's called? And it talks about the path that many migrants take to cross from Mexico to the U.S. Over the last 20 or 30 years now, the U.S. government has closed the easy routes to the United States, leaving only the most dangerous routes available, and a lot of people die. And so this follows migrants from their homes in Mexico and CBP officers, and sort of shows kind of two sides to the story of people traveling through the Devil's Highway.
And that the author did a podcast, I think it might have been Radiolab, I think. And he details what he did, why he did it, and he tells you in-depth stories about the book. And it is heart-wrenching. I mean, the U.S. policies designed to funnel people to areas where they knew people would die. And the argument was, if enough people die, then they'll stop. But of course, people haven't stopped, so people are dying, and it is remarkable. It's a remarkable book. Won awards, I believe, and it's maybe 4 or 5 years old, maybe a little bit more than that.
It's quite good.
Can I say quickly on that earlier point about classes and reading books? One thing I would tell you, and I would tell anybody, we're being taped, so please don't show the dean. He might not appreciate it, but he could have shown up if he had. Where's the tape at? So here's my view. It's two things. You come to law school not to learn anything, because you could buy a bunch of books and learn it. You come to learn to think like a lawyer. I don't know what that means, other than you get really annoying with your family and friends and they start hating you. So I guess I do know sort of what that means. But the biggest thing you do is you come to law school to connect with people, to build networks, to get mentors. That is the reason you're here. Whether you need 3 years for that or not, that is not my call. So you can't blame me for that. I don't think you need 3 years, really, if you were to ask me, but you're not asking. So what am I telling you is this. You should not wait for that course grid thing that I can never read. I just do search it with a control find because it's so tiny. Don't wait for that to come out for you to decide what you're going to do with the rest of your life. Be aggressive. Say, I want to learn immigration law. It's so many ways you can do that without having to sit in a class for a semester. It's kind of, here's an example. Bar courses. I don't know why you take them. If, settle down, if you don't want to take them. You could learn, whatever it is that you decide to do. There's books. You can learn it. You really can. You're really smart. That's why you're here. I have no doubts about that. And I'm not just pandering to you 100%, maybe 50. So same as for immigration law. Same as for anything. I have lots of ideas. B706. Do that. And I can give you 10 books, and we read them. I'll read them with you. We talk about it all semester, and you have 3 credits, and off you go. And you know more than you would know if you take. Or we figure things out, and I invite Christy for coffee, and we go and chat and lunch, and have some other lawyers. Who knows? Lots of ideas. But I'm encouraging you to think outside the box. If you want to do something, do it. Don't wait for a course that is not there, and that may never be there. We're working on it. It's just taking time. Because I think it's important. We should be doing more. There's no doubt about that. And we are trying. The royal we. Somebody's trying. And so, don't wait for that to happen. And there's people who want to help you. In fact, all of my colleagues should be wanting to help you. That's why we're here. So just take advantage of it. Don't just wait, but be aggressive. Take charge.
Thank you all for coming on behalf of LALSA and ACS. Please take pizza on your way out. Any LALSA or ACS members, please come to the front so we can take a group photo.